Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
Stalin has eyes in the British Foreign Office, the British Treasury, MI5, MI6, the cabinet minutes. He's getting minutes which kind of are about the war preparedness of the entire empire. And then in 1943, Bletchley Park. So, the level of access is unbelievable.
Antonia Senior's new book, Stalin's Apostles, challenges what you may have believed about the Cambridge Five, a group of British citizens who spied for the Soviet Union. Antonia argues that their actions during the Cold War have long been romanticised in popular culture. However, the reality is far more complex and tragic. Kim Philby, Donald Maclean, Guy Burgess, Anthony Blunt and John Cairncross were not merely glamorous rogues. Their espionage activities had dire consequences for countless individuals in Eastern and Central Europe. Antonia challenges the traditional narrative that often portrays them as victims of circumstance, highlighting instead the profound impact their betrayals had on nations and individuals who suffered under Stalinist regimes. Drawing on recently released MI5 documents and various international archives, the episode sheds light on the meticulous research that uncovers the broader implications of the Cambridge Five's actions. I'm delighted to welcome Antonia Senior to our Cold War conversation.
It is actually quite a long time since there has been a book about all five of them. And in that period, absolutely thousands of documents have been released by MI5 about the Cambridge Five, about the investigations into them, and more broadly, their associates and their friends and the other people who were involved. So that was important. The second thing that was important to me was I felt that the story that was being told culturally was one of glamorous rogues, posh boys beating the system, robbing secrets from the rich to empower the poor, and then getting a kind of sad comeuppance in Moscow. But I felt like the story presented it all the time as a victimless crime. And I actually sat down and I started to think, who was hurt by this? It wasn't just the members of the Reform Club, right? What did Stalin want from the Cambridge Five? What Stalin's great foreign policy project, from the minute they started spying for him till they were busted, was the expansion of the Soviet world out beyond the borders of Russia and into Europe, right? And they were incredibly helpful in that project. And when you turn it on its head and you start thinking that actually the people who suffered most from the Cambridge Five's terrible betrayals were the people of Eastern and Central Europe who ended up under Stalin's yoke and didn't want to be there, right? And they were betrayed by the Cambridge Five in so many myriad ways, which I get into in the book. And then as part of that, when I decided to turn it on its head, I went looking in other archives that hasn't necessarily been looked at too much in relation to the Five. So in telling the story, I used the Lithuanian KGB archives and the Albanian secret police archives to try and get the other side of Philby's well-chronicled betrayals of operations there. I was all over the CIA files, the US Navy intelligence files. There is huge amounts of material that has not been used. And what I wanted to do was scrape away all the secondary history. I did read it all, but I parked it and I went back to the archives and I started again.
Because I think the National Archives in 2025 released a number of new files, which gave a bit more detail, because there were quite a few transcriptions and stuff like that. So you got to hear more or be a little bit more on the inside there as to what the communications were going on.
Yeah, so they released some in 2019, more in 2022, more in 2025. So I guess they're doing them in 3-year tranches. There's no sort of rhyme nor reason really to how and when they release these things. So the ones in 2025 were the MI5 investigations primarily into Philby, Maclean and Cairncross. There was nothing in those files that I think massively changed the story, although it did change it in lots of ways. I had, before those files, completely underestimated how the lengths that MI5 had actually gone to try and get these guys. There's an assumption that MI5 just gave up the ghost, but no, they were on it and on it for decades. But so much incredible detail, like unbelievable, as you say, transcripts of things that we didn't know we would ever see. It was just, for someone immersed in Five law as I am, it was incredibly exciting to see loads of those files. Yeah, it was amazing.
We talk about the Cambridge Five, but I think you mention in the book that it's not really a ring, it's a chain, because these guys are great at the whole schmoozing and getting information from friends and acquaintances that help put together the wider picture for Soviet intelligence.
Yeah, absolutely. So we call them the Cambridge Five spy ring because they happen to have been at Cambridge, and also because the Russians called them the kind of Magnificent Five, right? So then when the story starts coming out in dribs and drabs, then the press get hold of this Magnificent Five thing, and then they're looking for the third, the fourth, the fifth. But actually, a ring implies that they all knew about each other and they were all in contact, and actually they weren't at all. John Cairncross never really knew any of the others, apart from when he was recruited by Burgess Blunt. Maclean took himself away from the others for most of the time. He didn't have very much to do with them at all, apart from at very small points. And yes, as you say, they were also involved with loads of other people. So Blunt's job before he joined MI5 at the start of the war was as a recruiter, and he was good at it. He recruited various young men into intelligence. And I, in the course of researching the book, identified 22 people who were giving the Cambridge Five secrets. There were three categories. One, sub-agents, men who knew that they were serving the Soviets and had been recruited primarily by Blunt, like Leo Long, Alistair Watson, people like that. The second category were really good friends of theirs who kind of probably knew that they might be giving secrets away, but was left-leaning fellow travellers, so were happy to feed them tidbits, but it was a kind of very liminal relationship. I put into that category Victor Rothschild, controversially. I know other people disagree with me. And the third category is people who just thought they were the friends, right? And they were gossiping in the pub, but they were really close friends. So they were giving them all sorts of intelligence that was finding its way back to the Soviets. Yeah. And that 22 is conservative, because I think that final category I mentioned is much bigger. How long is a piece of string? Burgess knew everybody in London. So, you've got to concentrate on the ones that you are pretty sure they actually wrinkled secrets out of. Yeah, absolutely. Fascinating and much broader cross-section of the secret parts of British state than we, I think, traditionally think of.
I'm glad you brought up Victor Rothschild, because he does intrigue me, because he seems to be in on everything, but not obviously part of the ring. He marries somebody who's very left-wing. He's running this flat at Bentinck Street where they're all hanging out as well, or he owns it. So he seems very implicated.
He is, I think, much more implicated than the traditional histories have. Victor Rothschild is great friends with Anthony Blunt. He knows Guy Burgess. He employs Guy Burgess in the 1930s to provide odd bits of financial intelligence, but it's really just to keep Burgess afloat. Rothschild's fabulously wealthy. So, yes, and then Rothschild is working for the government during the war as well, like a lot of these people. And then after the war, he doesn't give up his links with MI5. So he's constantly, we see him meddling all the time. And then he gets involved later on in the Spycatcher affair. Now, the killer thing for me about Victor Rothschild, there has been speculation about his role for years. There is a KGB general called Ivan Serov who wrote his memoirs, and when he fell from grace, as all KGB generals are going to eventually, he hid his memoirs in the wall of his dacha, and they were only found relatively recently. And obviously there was concern about authentication, but the kind of best Russian historians of the KGB now believe that these memoirs are kosher. In these memoirs, which are not yet translated into English, but I had the relevant parts translated, he talks about there's a trip where Khrushchev comes to Britain in the 50s, and Serov comes with him, and they meet up with Victor Rothschild at a party. And in his memoirs, Serov talks about Victor Rothschild as being fully aware of the activities of the Cambridge Five and of being a Soviet asset, as so far as he's giving the Soviets what secrets he can where he thinks it's useful to Israel. So Serov, who would know, specifically implicates him in the Cambridge Five world. So, and I think that added to the weird story around Kim Philby's final unmasking, which I also think he's much more involved with in nefarious ways than people have understood. I think there are big question marks about Victor Rothschild.
Why Cambridge University? The Soviets trying to infiltrate other universities in the UK? And they just had massive success with Cambridge.
So the Cambridge thing is actually, again, it's another bit of a kind of red herring and myth. So the way they all get recruited is after Kim Philby finishes at Cambridge, he has a kind of communist gap year. So he goes to Austria and he falls in love with an Austrian communist and he runs about, he's smuggling kind of arms or whatever, and he's having a marvellous time. Then, much to his parents' utter horror, his dad is a furious anti-Semite for one thing, Philby returns from his communist gap year with a communist Austrian wife who's also Jewish called Litzy Freeman. And Litzy is friends with a woman called Edith Tudor Hart, who is another communist from the Austrian scene. And Edith Tudor Hart is friends with an illegal, a guy who is over in Britain. He's working on behalf of Russian intelligence. His name is Arnold Deutsch. So Arnold Deutsch, and it does seem to be his idea, wants to take advantage of the fact that he notices that in Britain there is a kind of sudden, almost like a social contagion of very posh young men and women discovering communist revolutionary politics. And he thinks if he can find some of these young men and women, young men really, he can recruit them early, get them young, and then watch them rise, right? So that's his plan. And through the Austrian connection, he meets Kim Philby and he recruits Kim Philby. And then Kim Philby's first job as a new recruit is to give Arnold Deutsch a list of all likely recruits. And because Kim Philby happened to go to Cambridge, the names on that list are all from Cambridge. Now, there are also spies recruited at Oxford. We know a few of them. None of them were quite as successful as the Cambridge Five. That, again, is more of a kind of matter of luck than specific Soviet brilliance, understanding that Cambridge was the one to subvert. It was more a kind of happenstance than a plan in that sense.
And these spies are recruited in the mid-1930s in the main. And at that point, Stalin is embarking on the Great Terror. There's the famine in Ukraine as well. And that news is getting back to the UK. People are very clear what's going on in the Soviet Union, yet these guys just carry on. It doesn't seem to affect their allegiance to the Soviet Union.
I think it does the opposite, actually. And I think if you are a young revolutionary in the 1930s, you believe that revolutions are supposed to be bloody. You believe that people are supposed to die. If you just don't think it's going to be you. That's the revolutionaries never think it's going to be them against the wall, do they? And among their friends at Cambridge, for example, one of the kind of leading luminaries of the Cambridge communist scene was like a massive fanboy of Bela Kun, the first communist leader, precisely because Bela Kun enacted a terror and was ruthless. And they write these dreadful poems about being determined to see through the cause no matter what the cost to their soul and all this nonsense. They want to be involved in something that tears the world down and then builds it up again. So I think they know, and I went to lots of pains in my researching the book to make it clear how much was known in the 30s, because there's another lie about the Cambridge Five, that nothing was known about Stalin in the 30s and that they were just good anti-fascists who got accidentally drawn into supporting an evil totalitarian regime. It's nonsense. They knew everything. And not only did they know everything in the 30s, they also, Arnold Deutsch got caught up in the terror. Others of their handlers got caught up in the terror. The very men who recruited them were put against a wall by Stalin, and they knew this. And then these anti-fascists stood by and watched Stalin become an ally of Hitler. And again, it didn't give them pause at all. They carried on spying for him regardless. No, I think they were attracted by the ideology's ruthlessness and by the kind of revolutionary fervour.
And we'll come on to the Nazi-Soviet pact in a little while there. But he's sort of in journalism. And he manages to get a job with the Times as a journalist during the Spanish Civil War. And I think that the Soviets initially tasked him to assassinate Franco.
So Walter Kravitsky, who is a defector, says that there has been a journalist who's been tasked with assassinating Franco. But he's really the only source for this story. It's not really backed up elsewhere. Philby denies it. but Philby is untrustworthy as a witness about his own life. So Philby's denial is meaningless. There is not, however, any real supporting evidence about that. He does get very close to Franco's group. He does this partly by using his connections, partly by sleeping with a very glamorous fascist woman and getting close that way. And in fact, he is so pro-Franco in his reporting for the Times that Franco actually gives him a medal. So Philby will end this story with medals from Franco, Churchill and Stalin, which I think is probably a rare trio.
Yeah, the hat trick.
Yeah. Yeah.
Gosh. Yeah, and there is a lot of sex and bed hopping in this book, which I'm going to have to reword that. Hang on a sec, Antonia. I'm trying to think of how I'm going to phrase this. Yeah, Philby is somewhat infamous as a seducer, and he's not the only one in this book either, but I don't want to spoil some of the details that are in the book there. With his father being a pro-Nazi, that obviously helps him with his credentials in Spain, but they're all been told to hide their communist past.
Yeah, it's the first job is to stop being an obvious communist, right? So Kim Philby, he gives this list to Arnold Deutsch, and the name at the top of the list of best recruits is Donald Maclean, who has been a virulent communist all the way through university. He's at Trinity Hall in Cambridge. Although crucially, neither him nor Kim Philby ever joined the Communist Party because both of them want to join the Foreign Office. And even though, as my book makes clear, vetting is not a strong point of the British government in this period, actual membership of the Communist Party would have been a problem. So neither of them actually joined. But they are overt communists to their friends. But as soon as they've been recruited by the Soviets, both Kim Philby and Donald Maclean start pretending not to be, right? And this is how Guy Burgess gets into the picture, because Guy Burgess was the bottom of Kim Philby's list, because even though he's a very committed communist and a very clever man, he's also wild and flaky and hopeless. I was doing a podcast the other day, and the podcaster said he's basically what the young people today would call a hot mess. And I think that's actually probably fair. Burgess is at the bottom of that list, but when he notices that two of his really good friends from Cambridge, who had been massive communists, are now cosplaying at being fascists, there is something going on. He needles them, he bugs them, he demands to know what this big secret is, and he's brilliant at badgering. So he basically badgers his way into also getting signed up into Soviet intelligence. So that's how Burgess gets in. And then, Burgess too, for a while, pretends not to be a communist. He doesn't do it very well, and everybody knows he's just messing. But Guy Burgess is so often socially outrageous that even when he tells people he's a spy, nobody believes him. So yeah.
You talked about vetting there. So MI6, when they're vetting Philby, know that he had a wife who was a communist, don't they?
It's not quite clear when they know that he had a wife who was a communist. It wasn't immediately. They do know that he dallied with communism. I think the issue with all of their recruitment into the most secret parts of the British state, not so much Donald Maclean and John Cairncross, who joined the Foreign Office straight out of Cambridge, so they're on an upward trajectory in a different world. But Blunt was supposed to stay in Cambridge as a recruiter. Philby was having a pretty ordinary career as a journalist. He was a very good journalist, actually, annoyingly. But the reason why they get into MI5 and MI6 is at the start of the war, there is a massive explosion of demand for men in the most secret parts of the British states. MI6 expands tenfold, MI5 expands tenfold. SOE, a special operations executive, is built from nowhere, and that demands 16,000 staff or something. There's other bits like the political warfare executive, and they're all fighting over the same people. And if all of them had been vetted properly, they would have still been vetting them by the time the war was over. Okay, so to be fair to them, it was incredibly difficult to vet these people properly. Also, to be fair to them, they had no conception of the existence of men like the Cambridge Five. As far as the people doing the recruiting in the early part of the war were concerned, Britain was facing an existential threat to its very existence. And a really obvious way to get good chaps in was just, do you know this guy? Is he a friend of yours? Could you introduce him to your wife? Is he clever? Will he fit in? And these seemed like the questions to ask. Is he secretly a Soviet spy? It was on nobody's radar, right? It didn't even occur to them that men of their class could be doing what they were doing. I should just say that the Cambridge Five move about and they're differently important to the Soviets at different points. So some of them are more important than others at different points. But broadly, you get a situation where Stalin has eyes in the British Foreign Office, the British Treasury, MI5, MI6, oversight therefore through those of SOE. And then in 1943, John Cairncross goes to Bletchley Park. The level of access is unbelievable. There are points where Stalin's getting the cabinet minutes, he's getting the Imperial War Defense Committee minutes, which kind of are about the war preparedness of the entire empire. His access to information is extraordinary.
We mentioned a little while earlier the Nazi-Soviet pact. So in 1939, Stalin decides he needs to deal with Hitler, and they put together a pact which allows them to divide Poland and various other parts of Eastern Europe. So that, you would think, is a major challenge for somebody who's as ideologically motivated as the Cambridge Five, because, as you say, they are believing themselves to be anti-fascists, and suddenly the government who they're passing all these secrets to is in cahoots with Adolf Hitler.
Yeah, it's unbelievable, right? And there are communists all over Europe tearing up their party membership cards in protest at this moment. Stalin will later present this as a cunning ploy whereby he was trying to buy time in order to build up the resources to take on the Nazis properly. This is complete hindsight whitewashing. What Stalin was doing is he saw an opportunity to get what he wanted, which is Poland and the Baltic states. He wanted to reanimate the Russian Empire that the Bolsheviks had lost in the Russian Civil War immediately following the revolution. And huge numbers of people saw through this. And at the time, in August 39, when it happens, even the kind of left-wing newspapers in Britain see through this. They do not talk about it as a cunning plan. They talk about it as an absolute moral failure on Stalin's part to jump into bed with Hitler. So you would think, one of the guys recruited by Anthony Blunt is a guy called Goronwy Rees, and he and another guy recruited by Anthony Blunt who went to America called Michael Straight. Both of them, and they seem to be telling the truth, although again they're not entirely reliable sources. Both of them stop spying when the Nazi-Soviet pact happens, right? And in fact, Burgess goes to see Goronwy Rees when the Nazi-Soviet pact is signed. They both outwardly vow to stop spying for the Soviets. But then Guy Burgess walks away from that meeting, goes to find his Russian handler and says, I'm going to keep spying for you. Please, can you kill Goronwy Rees? He's a threat to me. This is the kind of these are the kind of men we're talking about. And I think there are two things happening. One is they are Stalinists and they believe in the project. Two is they like doing it, right? So it's not just the ideology. It's an unfortunate marrying of a really passionate ideological belief and really toxic personalities that mean they're actually enjoying the act of betrayal and what that means and the secrecy. And the Philby particular, you can see it in his memoir. He has such glee when he's the only person who knows that he's the spider in the center of a web that other people don't even know exists. So they love it and they don't want to give it up. Donald Maclean writes this absolutely horribly fawning letter to Soviet intelligence in 1940 when Hitler and Stalin are in bed with each other going, oh, working for you is my life. I live for it. Please don't cut me off. I just want to serve the revolution. They're in it. They stay the course, as Philby puts it.
And despite the fact that some of the intelligence they're passing to the Soviets may be passing to the Germans.
Exactly. Philby is embedded as a journalist with the British Expeditionary Force at the beginning of the war when Stalin and Hitler are best pals. And Philby is passing on everything he can. He's finding it quite difficult, actually. He has to work really hard to get his information to the Soviets because all of his handlers have been shot by Stalin. He has to really work at it, but he does get that information. So he's feeding information about the British Expeditionary Force to Stalin when Stalin is Hitler's ally. Donald Maclean is doing the same from the Foreign Office, as is John Cairncross. Whatever they can find, they're giving. And yeah, I would love to say that we had found a smoking gun to say that we could see a trail leading from the Cambridge Five through Moscow to Berlin. We haven't, okay, because a lot of this stuff is quite obscure and hidden and you can't get full access to any of it. So we don't, but they didn't know that. How are they going to know that?
I mean, of all of the five, it's Cairncross is the one that people probably most struggle to name. Yet he probably delivers some of the most important information in terms of the Maud report.
Yeah, Cairncross, listen, I think Cairncross is overdue another look. There's a couple of quite good biographies of him, one really good one by Chris Smith, but that's before all the stuff came out in that we talked about at the beginning from MI5 last year. John Cairncross is a very complicated, slippery character who presents himself as an anti-fascist. People believe it. There is dark stuff. But yes, the Maud report. So John Cairncross is working as the private secretary to a guy called Maurice Hankey, who is a cabinet minister at the time of the Maud report, which is the big moment where the British start exploring the feasibility of making nuclear weapons. And the Maud report lays out how this might happen. And John Cairncross leaks this to the Soviets. So we know about the atomic spies. It was central to how Stalin goes on to develop the bomb. But the very first atomic spy, the very first person to tell the Soviets that this was on the cards was John Cairncross.
Not Melita Norwood.
No. Well, I mean, you know, the atomic story is actually quite a complicated one. And I know you've done plenty of work on it because there were lots of people feeding the Russians. And actually, for a long time, the Soviets didn't actually care because this is the other part of the coin, right? So you can see all the time where the Cambridge Five have access to material like the Maud report. You can see some of the material that the Soviets read and took seriously because we had access to for a while to the Soviet archives, largely through the work of the intelligence historian Nigel West, who got some grief actually because he didn't speak Russian and he was minded while he was in those archives. But actually nothing he's brought out of those archives has ever been disproved when other flickers of things come through. So we have that, but we can't always make the really strong link between the access and then the end result of Soviet actions, because there are so many stages. The stuff's got to get to Russia, it's got to be read, it's got to be passed through to Stalin, and Stalin's mind is a mystery, you know, to greater historians than us. So yeah, the atomic spy story is complicated because when Cairncross passes the information, it does take a long time for the Soviets to actually grapple with how important this information is and to start really ramping up their program.
But also within Soviet intelligence, there's some suspicions that the five are double agents. They're actually working for British intelligence. Yeah,
so there is a couple of reasons why a number of people in the Soviet system begin to get a bit suspicious of the five mid-war. So one is that they have such incredible access to stuff that the Soviets can't believe the stuff they're seeing because it's such high-grade intelligence. Number two is that you mentioned Bentinck Street, but so Burgess and Blunt live together in Bentinck Street, and it's flat just behind Oxford Street. And Guy Liddell, who's like head of counterintelligence at MI5, he stays on their sofa all the time. Victor Rothschild's in and out. Like the Russians can't believe that there's this kind of cozy relationship between all these like top level intelligence people, and they're just in and out of each other's houses drinking gin, and that it's not all deeply suspicious. And then the other part of it is the Russians keep saying to Blunt and Philby, right, tell us your operations against us. And Blunt and Philby both say there aren't any. And the reason they say that is because there weren't any. We were not spying on the Soviets really until right at the end of the war, until 1944. And the reason we weren't spying on them is because there was a kind of slightly naive sense that you don't spy on your allies. This is an over-exaggeration. We were spying on them, but nowhere near like they were spying on us. And then Blunt would tell them things like, oh yeah, we only have the capacity to tap a few phones and we don't work weekends. And Soviet intelligence, now you're lying. Because the Soviets then, as now, have an outsized kind of idea of what the British are capable of and up for. So when we were disappointing them, they thought they were lying. But again, it's slightly more complicated because there was one person who was really anti the five, and not all of the five either, mainly Philby and Burgess and Blunt. And her name was Elena Modrosinkaya. I can't really say her name, but that's an approximation.
I'm glad you had a go.
Yeah. Even within the KGB, like not everybody agrees with her assessment. So her boss isn't sure and thinks that they may be okay. And they keep getting their information anyway. And then they lay little traps for them, little tests to see if they can work out if they're true. Oh, there's another reason, of course, which is that Anthony Blunt has full access to everything about the double cross operations against the Nazis. So that once the Russians realize that the British are running double cross operations, they're like, aha, maybe this is a double cross operation. And of course it wasn't. So there's a period where not all of them are entirely trusted, but their information is still getting through and still being used. And if it can be verified from other sources, they're just a sort of wariness about them. But it doesn't last very long, and it's not institutionally, it's not the whole of the KGB that distrusts them.
And the volume of stuff that they are sending out is phenomenal, particularly Maclean in his early days. And I guess this is the other thing that the Soviets are suspicious of, is they can walk out of MI5, MI6 with briefcases, or the Foreign Office with briefcases full of top secret information.
Yeah.
But with Maclean, he's bringing out so much information. I think that the Soviet photographer has a nervous breakdown trying to deal with all of this work.
Yeah, his handler at that point is in the early part of the war is like literally weeping and sending telegrams to Moscow saying, I can't deal with all of this information. And there's an amazing bit in the autobiography of their later handler, who's a guy called Yuri Modin. And Modin starts his career in Soviet intelligence as the guy in Moscow reading the stuff that the five are sending to Moscow. And there's just like piles of it. And he says, sometimes we were overwhelmed and we just pick a piece of paper at random off the top and then tell ourselves we would get to the rest of it the next day, but we might not ever get to it. That's another reason why some of it might not have got through. And John Cairncross at Bletchley Park, John Cairncross at Bletchley Park, and every sort of like day or whatever it is, the top secret stuff from Bletchley Park travels by train to London in a like buff coloured box, and only Churchill's got a key at one end and somebody else has got a key at Bletchley Park, and it's like all whatever. And meanwhile, John Cairncross, who's working as an interpreter, is just picking the German decrypts up off the floor, stuffing them down his trousers, walking out. Yeah, you can see why the Soviets began to be a bit raised eyebrows about all of this. But yeah, huge amounts of stuff. Huge, like tens of thousands of documents. Again, like it goes in waves of access and when they're most important. But yeah, like piles of documents. And so the really urgent stuff, most of it just goes overland in like diplomatic bags. But if it's incredibly urgent, it's telegrammed from London to Moscow. And then in 1944, Donald Maclean is posted to the Washington embassy. And then anything urgent that he gets in the US goes by telegram. And that's one of the ways, we'll talk, I'm sure, about these telegrams being broken, but that's one of the ways we can work out what's important to the Soviets and what isn't, because when you can see that it's gone by telegram, you know that it's important to Stalin, because these are his henchmen trying to please him. So they're getting this information to him quickly.
During this period, they're feeding Stalin information on the West's reaction to the Katyn forest massacre, where the Soviets have murdered thousands, I think, of Polish officers and intelligentsia there. And by passing that information, that Stalin's able to recalibrate how he's negotiating with the West there. It's these hidden sort of, they're not hidden details, but it has massive implications for the people of those countries, particularly in Poland, because Blunt is also involved in this, providing details about the Polish resistance movement in Poland.
Yeah, this is it. When you look at what's important to Stalin, occasionally you can see things getting to his desk. And so much of what he's interested in is Poland, right? Poland is a real bugbear for him. He wants it. He wants to keep it. So there are various ways we can see. I think one of the really interesting ones is 1942, there is a negotiation for an Anglo-Soviet treaty, which is framing how they're going to be allies and the transfer of equipment and money from Britain to help the Soviets fight the war. And both sides really want this treaty. The British go into it absolutely determined that they're going to get some words on Baltic and Polish sovereignty. The Soviets go into it absolutely determined that the British can do one, right? They're not going to get these fine words. And then amazingly, so Guy Burgess was getting chapter and verse and all the detail day by day on the British negotiating positions during the treaty negotiations. He was getting them from a kind of guy he was running, a sub-agent in the news department called Harry Smollett, and then he was passing this on. So every single time the British go into a negotiating room, the Soviets know the British position. If you're negotiating a deal, you've got the position you put on the table at the first point, right? You've got the backstop position, and then you've got your secret position that you're not going to reveal unless you absolutely have to at the end. And you can see in these transcripts of the stuff that Burgess leaks to the Russians, to the Soviets, that they have all of those positions. They know them all. So they completely out-negotiate the British, and they end up with no words at all in the treaty about Polish borders or Baltic sovereignty. And this happens again at Tehran, and it happens again at Yalta. It's just, you can see it right from the beginning. And then again, with Katyn. So 22,000 Polish officers are murdered in the forest of Katyn by the Soviets, right? And the Germans, when they find the mass graves, make a big song and dance about it. And the Allies then are in a quandary, right? Churchill is in a quandary particularly. He's gone to war ostensibly for Poland. He is rhetorically a great ally of Poland. And now he is faced with a situation increasingly where the demands of Stalin and the needs of his Polish allies are in conflict continually. And Churchill is getting cross with the Poles because he feels like it's beginning to be their fault. They don't know what the Poles were supposed to do, just roll over, but they wouldn't. And Katyn's important because thanks to Philby's reports on it to the Soviets know that Churchill knows that it was them, but Churchill is ostensibly accepting Stalin's blandishments that it was the Germans. And this kind of thing matters because totalitarian regimes need people to buy the lie publicly. They need people to prop them up by being part of the kind of general the lie. So Churchill knowing the truth but agreeing to lie is quite seismic in Polish-Russian relations. And not just in the moment, but it stands as a sort of emblematic moment for how all of that plays out, that Stalin perpetually provokes Churchill to accept the lies. And he can see all the background misery that Churchill feels accepting the lies because he's being passed it all by the fag.
Incredible. The major coup for Philby, though, is he becomes head of Section 9, which is the Department to Catch Soviet Spies, which is incredible. But I'm always interested in the role of Jane Archer here because she is, I think, MI5's first female officer. And she gets moved into Section 9. And Philby is concerned because she had interviewed Kravitsky, the Soviet defector that we mentioned before, and she had been told about a young English journalist who Soviet intelligence had sent to Spain and during the Civil War, and he's worried that the link will be made.
Yeah, he's nervous of Jane Archer because she's very good. And what he does as soon as he gets into Section 9, which, as you say, is MI6's Soviet counterintelligence unit, it's extraordinary. But even that, you pause on that fact for a second. The man in charge of Soviet counterintelligence at the end of the Cold War, when it's becoming obvious we've got a Stalin problem, is a Soviet spy. It's unbelievable. Anyway, so the first thing he does is start trying to make the department look effective while being ineffective. So he's worried about Jane Archer, but luckily for him, she thinks that the spy that was named by Kravitsky, she thinks it's a guy called Esmond who's actually died in the war. So she is convinced that problem has gone away. But that doesn't mean that she won't remember once if Philby is too good at being crap at Soviet counterintelligence. And the other reason why I found Jane Archer's role really interesting is because, so this is a period at the end of the war, 1944, where all over Europe, we think of the end of the war as a clean thing, right? As a moment where everybody goes on the streets and snogs their sailor. But like across Europe, the ending to the war was not clean, right? There were little partisan wars all over Europe. People in the lands coveted by Stalin, there were men and women who'd been fighting the Nazis, and now they were turning their attention to try and fight the Soviets because they wanted sovereignty for themselves. So one of Jane Archer's jobs for Philby at the end of the war was to identify any kind of partisan groups that she could that were operating in Europe that might become a problem for the Soviets. Now, of course, the British wanted that information, but so did the Soviets. So we can be pretty sure that anything that Jane Archer found, and she was an effective intelligence agent, that would quite likely have gone to two masters. So in that ending bit of the war where there's already a kind of a little bit of a shadow war where the British and the Americans are trying to arm non-communist partisans in various unstable places, and the Soviets tried to do the opposite. Philby's right in the middle of all of that. He just messing, like meddling, and also sometimes doing really cruel things. Like he goes to Germany and he interviews Soviet prisoners of war in Germany, and then anything he can find out about them he passes on too. But what is it, something like half of all the Soviets prisoners of war who went home to Russia were killed or sent to the Gulag. The ones who knew they were going home started killing them, and the camps were rife with suicides, and Philby was going in there interviewing these men, and anything he could, sending, I mean, the callousness is breathtaking.
And the callousness is not just with his spying, because in 1940 he's married Aileen Furs, and the books in the past have generally said she was unstable, she was mentally ill, and she eventually commits suicide. But there is some doubt as to whether it is suicide and whether she's killed herself. And certainly Philby treated her incredibly badly.
He did. And Eileen has had a really bad press. Poor old Philby with his mentally unstable wife. But Philby, I don't like retrospective, ill-informed psychoanalysts by historians. So I didn't put this in the book. But Philby's obviously some sort of sociopath, right? To be able to be as cruel as he is, and to be as callous as he is, and to talk with the glee that he does about the men that he sends to their deaths, right? There is something cold and dark at the heart of Kim Philby, and she is married to that, right? And she can see him. And not only that, the point where she has her major breakdown is when they are stationed in Istanbul, and she has Guy Burgess living in her basement. She has 4 kids under 6 or something, Kim Philby as her husband, and Kim Philby's mistress living in the attic. Like, I feel quite sad for Eileen. So she does have a number of breakdowns, and she does some bizarre, she acts very bizarrely, and it's all very cry for helpish. And so she commits suicide in the late 50s, and one of the files that emerged in that 25 file dump that we talked about was she was seeing a psychiatrist before her death. And we know, by the way, that in this period, Philby was treating her very badly because he was being watched by MI5 throughout the 50s. And what seems to be happening, according to these files, is that Eileen would basically get to the point where she was like, I can't bear it. I'm going to tell MI5 everything I know. And then Philby would suddenly be really nice to her, even though he had, at that point, yet another mistress on the go. And then once she calmed down and had stabilized and said, okay, I'm not going to tell anybody, and she's pathetically grateful that he's being nice to her and nice to the children, then he starts being horrible again. And the MI5 watchers describe him treating her with horrible brutality. And these are not like the cuddly woke policemen of today, right? These are MI5 guys in the 1950s. If they say you're being brutal, you are being brutal. So she's seeing a psychiatrist, And as soon as she commits suicide, her psychiatrist writes to her GP and he demands that the GP check her body for puncture wounds. The psychiatrist, who knows all the secrets of the Philby marriage, is convinced that Philby has either murdered her himself or had her murdered. And yeah, it doesn't seem that the GP did it. And actually, funnily enough, as well, Peter Wright puts it in one of the released documents. There's an interview between Peter Wright and Anthony Blunt later on, and Peter Wright says to Blunt, "Do you think Philby killed his wife?" Blunt said, "I don't know, but he's definitely ruthless enough to have done it."
Wow. What happened to the kids? Because Philby certainly wouldn't have been looking after them after the death of his wife.
Yeah, so they stay in Britain with Eileen's sister, Melanie Leroyd. And actually, to be fair to Philby, and I'm not often fair to Philby, his letters home to his children and his concern for his children do seem very loving and unfeigned. It feels almost weird reading them because it's the moment where you actually feel some sympathy for him. And there's one point where Philby's own sister writes him a letter saying, listen, the children are bullied at school because of you. They're unhappy because of you. None of them really understand why you've left them. I think maybe you should stop writing to them. This is destabilizing. They're unhappy, bullied children. And then the older one even goes off the rails a bit. He gets arrested for breaking into an off license a bit later on. Yeah, it is sad. They're victims too, actually, because their mother's dead and their father's in Moscow and they're being bullied at school because everybody knows their dad's a traitor and a spy.
I did interview Charlotte Philby a while back about her grandfather and her visits to see him in Moscow, and it was interesting. You got a sort of different side to it, and I guess everybody has a different side to their family, to other things, but he was her grandfather, Grandpa Kimsky, I think they used to call him.
I'm sure Charlotte Philby has her own memories of it, but like in the files and you see the letters when it's still raw, it's very raw.
There'll be a link to Charlotte Philby's interview in the episode information. Do check that out. Well worth a listen. The Cambridge Five starts to unravel with the Venona decrypts. Can you just briefly outline what that is?
Yeah, the Americans are running this top secret project called Venona. And this is based on the fact that Soviet intelligence uses one-time pads to send messages across between its embassies and Moscow to encrypt messages. And at one point in the early 1940s, the factory making these one-time pads duplicates a few, right? Which gives the American code breakers a tiny wrinkle to allow them to get into the messages. So at the end of the 40s, they start working out, getting into some of these telegrams. And then it takes them a while to pin down the fact that there has been a spy in Washington. They are able to get into the telegrams from 1944 and 1945 when Donald Maclean was in the Washington embassy. And Donald Maclean was unbelievably at this late stage of the war when Churchill and Roosevelt were trying to do what they could to stop Stalin's power grab and land grab. Donald Maclean was giving the Soviets the personal correspondence between Churchill and Roosevelt, so Stalin could see everything. And this is all in the telegrams that begin to be decoded at the end of the 40s and into 1950. So they're aware that there's a spy, they just don't know who it is, right? So their first thought in the manner of the British Foreign Office is it must be foreigners employed at the embassy. So they spend ages investigating all the foreigners, like the cleaners and the whatever. And then they begin to realize, okay, no, it really must be one of us. So the net begins to draw ever closer to Donald Maclean. Now, in late 1949, Philby is sent to the Washington embassy as liaison with the Americans, as MI6 guy in America liaising there. And rather unbelievably, it is clear now from declassified files that Philby was put on the team to investigate who this top secret mole could possibly be. So Philby's doing what he can to muddy the waters. Like, he casts some shade on this guy called Gore Booth, who is very suspicious to the British Foreign Office because he's a teetotaler, if you can imagine such a thing. So he's doing what he can to muddy the waters, but eventually in sort of April 1951, it becomes clear to Philby that MI5, they're going to go for Donald Maclean very soon.
And prior to that, Philby has been working on the resistance movements in the Baltics and the Ukraine.
Yeah, and Albania. Yeah.
And Albania as well. In fact, I've just done an interview with an author who's just written a book about CIA.
Stephen Long, yeah. I listened to the interview and I've read the book and it's brilliant. And he and I disagree on how far Philby was responsible. But yes, brilliant interview. Brilliant
disagree agreeably, I think.
Yes.
There'll be a link to Stephen Long's interview in the episode information. Again, that's well worth a listen for his views on Philby's involvement in the betrayal of the Albanian resistance. Philby has been working on Albania, and obviously he's feeding some of that information, or if not all of that information, to the Soviets, and it's then getting routed to the Albanians and the MGB, as it was then, in the Baltics and the Ukraine. And that's where your book opens as well, with a description of those initial missions. It's a great opening to the book. And I think that this is where you highlight the cost of this spy ring, the human cost, the personal cost of betrayal of friends. And when you total up that bill, it is huge, the implications of what just 5 students from Cambridge University, the damage that they did.
Yeah, absolutely. Both diplomatically and on the ground. There were 2 ways that they served Stalin's project. One was, as I say, giving him the edge in all the negotiations around what he was doing to consolidate his control in the East. And Donald Maclean, the personal correspondence of Roosevelt and Churchill. Another of my favourite Donald Maclean moments is when they set up NATO. They know how sensitive NATO is going to be to the Soviets. They know, because we can see how sensitive NATO is to them today, right? So they have the initial discussions in a lead-lined room in the basement of the Pentagon, and they don't invite the French because the French are really leaky, and nobody's allowed to take notes. And the man who is charged by the British Embassy in Washington with leading the British negotiations over the creation of NATO is Donald Maclean. So Donald Maclean is in the room, right? It's unbelievable. And then you've got the second strand, which is on the ground, this Philby portraying absolutely every operation that he can, from Ukraine to Albania to Lithuania. And I go into all of that in great detail in the book, and I use the Albanian secret police files to flesh that out, and the Lithuanian files as well, which really helped me get a grasp on how the Soviets used basically Philby's information and kind of hyper-local anti-counterintelligence on the ground, the 2 things combining to basically totally flatten resistance across Eastern and Central Europe. Yeah, I think they were seismically important. I guess the obvious thought, counterfactual, is without them, would Stalin still have had an empire? And my argument is basically the single most important reason why Stalin ends up with an empire is the Red Army boots on the ground, and you can't get away from that. This is what matters. However, he did have to consolidate that control and turn it into lasting political control. And in the way that it did happen, and the way that he did manage to do that, the Cambridge Five were incredibly helpful and useful to that project.
Absolutely. So we go back to Washington. Maclean is there. The Americans are on his trail. Philby's there. Incredibly, Burgess is there as well, raising merry hell in Washington, getting arrested or getting speeding tickets and all sorts. And Philby realizes that Maclean's time is up.
Yeah, Maclean is in London at this point. He's been sent home from Cairo in disgrace as a terrible alcoholic, and then is promoted to the head of the American department. Burgess is in Washington because he got in trouble for being a terrible alcoholic, so he was promoted to join the Washington embassy. He makes a terrible hash of his time in Washington. It is not entirely clear if Burgess faked the last showdown that got him sent home in disgrace, which involved, as you say, like a car and a boy and alcohol, or whether it was just coincidence and happenstance that he is still not quite clear. So he goes home and he tells Maclean, "You are being watched. Your time is up." Now, absolutely amazingly, we now have all the reports from the MI5 watchers who were watching Donald Maclean in the days leading up to the defection. So he'd been quite well behaved before Burgess's return. And then we know the day that Burgess told him. They don't know that it's Guy Burgess, but they know that he goes to lunch with someone. They then watch Donald Maclean get absolutely rolling drunk. They watch him end up in this bar in Shepherd's Market in London, which I've been to, it's still there, where he gets even more drunk and he ends up basically with a woman that they call MI5 called Kay. And then the night that he finds out his entire life is about to implode and he's about to be arrested as a Soviet spy, Donald Maclean is watched getting into a taxi with Kay and heading off into the night. And the MI5 watchers say they're not entirely sure, but they think that Kay was sitting on Donald Maclean's knee. So that's how he responds. Meanwhile, his wife, Melinda, who knows all about him being a Soviet spy, is at home and 8.5 months pregnant. Although possibly not with Donald Maclean's child, I discovered in the course of my research. It was possibly somebody else's. But anyway, I don't know if Maclean knows that. So yeah, there we have it. He's told. And then for the next 2 weeks, MI5 are watching. And we have all the reports. We have them getting deeply concerned about Guy Burgess because they work out who he is. And Donald Maclean and him keep meeting. They're looking agitated and conspiratorial. We have an unbelievable document where the MI5 watchers, they know that Guy Burgess is good friends with Guy Liddell, who's their boss, right? At this point, he's deputy head of MI5. They go to Guy Liddell and they say, "Look, Guy Burgess keeps meeting Donald Maclean and they're looking really dodgy and really conspiratorial." And Guy Liddell says, "Oh, that's just Guy. That's what he's like." So MI5, just stop worrying about Guy, concentrate on Maclean. So the MI5 guy isn't entirely sure about this. So he goes to the head of security at the Foreign Office, a guy called George Carey Foster, and he says to Carey Foster, "We're worried about Guy Burgess." Carey Foster says, "Guy Burgess always looks mad. Just ignore him. Concentrate on Maclean." So when a day later they see Guy Burgess in the street holding his head, like literally pacing up and down, looking like he's going to kill someone, they just leave him to it. The very next day, Maclean and Burgess defect. Yeah, extraordinary scenes.
But that's the whole story of the Cambridge Five. It's just Guy being Guy. People always get drunk. The amount of alcohol that's consumed in this book is phenomenal, and it's chaps just don't spy for the communists. They just don't do that.
I know. There is so much booze in this book, Ian, that I'm an enthusiastic boozer, but I actually stopped drinking for 4 months because I just was so irritated by their constantly appalling behavior. And I was like, oh God, these middle-aged people getting drunk and behaving appallingly. And I thought, I don't want to be like them. So I actually came off it. There's one night in Istanbul where Burgess and Philby and Philby's mistress, Esther, drink between them 52 brandies in one session.
Wow. I'm sure you were intoxicated by the details you were getting from the National Archives and the Albanian archives and Lithuanian archives to need any alcoholic stimulation there.
Pretty much.
There is so much more in the book. We've skated across the surface of what's in the book, but there is a lot more. I found it a really good read. I learnt a lot about the Cambridge Five that I didn't know. And I've read quite a few books, as you can imagine, being Cold War conversations. And it was fascinating, tragic, funny, shocking in so many ways. But it definitely comes Cold War conversations recommended. What I'll do is I'll probably add a proper outro to that rather than my
that
ramblings.
Sounds brilliant. Do that one you've just done. I like that
Okay, I'll leave that one in. But that was great fun. I really enjoyed that.
That was magic.
We covered quite a lot. Hopefully you enjoyed it as well.
I did. It's lovely to talk to someone who really knows the stuff.
Want to learn more? Don't miss the episode extras such as curated videos, photos and other content. Just look for the link in the episode description. Special thanks to the generous efforts of our financial supporters who keep the show on the air. If you'd like to join this select band, go to coldwarconversations.com/donate. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening and see you next week.